A lonely widow adopts a retired police dog to keep her company. But when danger strikes, she discovers that Max is more than just a companion. He's a hero in disguise. As the night unfolds, she must rely on his strength to survive. But what happens when the true power of his past comes to light, and the neighborhood faces a threat they never saw coming? Hilda never imagined her life would take such a turn after the passing of her husband. At 72, she thought her days would be filled with quiet solitude, interrupted only by the occasional visit from her grown children. But everything changed the moment she adopted Max. She still remembered that day vividly. The animal shelter was bustling with activity, filled with the chatter of potential adopters and the excited barking of dogs. Hilda had no intention of leaving with a companion that day. She had merely gone along with a friend who was considering adoption. Yet something about Max caught her eye. Standing tall and stoic in his kennel, his sharp amber eyes seemed to pierce through the chaos. "This is Max," the shelter worker had explained, "a Belgian Malinois. He's a retired police dog, about 8 years old. He's got a lot of love left to give." Hilda hesitated at first. Could she handle a dog like him? But when Max approached the edge of the kennel and rested his head on the bars, their connection felt undeniable. He wasn't just a dog, he was a soul who understood loss, just as she did. Over the years, Max became more than a pet. He was her confidant, her protector, and her companion on long walks through their quiet suburban neighborhood. Despite his formidable appearance and disciplined demeanor, Max had a gentle heart. He'd nudge her hand when she seemed lost in thought, reminding her to stay present. The pair became a familiar sight in the area, often seen strolling down tree-lined streets or sitting together on a park bench. The tranquility of the neighborhood provided a peaceful backdrop to their bond. Children played on front lawns, couples tended to their gardens, and the hum of life moved at a comfortable pace. Yet beneath the surface, a sense of unease began to creep into the community. Reports of thefts and break-ins filtered through conversations at the local grocery store and the small church Hilda attended. "It's not like it used to be," a neighbor had remarked one Sunday after service. Hilda listened but didn't dwell on the fears. Max's presence gave her an unwavering sense of security. In the evenings, she often found herself watching Max as he lay by the fireplace, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. She wondered about his past, about the dangers he'd faced as a police dog, and the loyalty that had been ingrained in him. It comforted her to know that, despite whatever darkness his old job might have brought, Max had chosen her as his person. For Max, the transition from a life of action to quiet retirement hadn't been seamless. At first, he'd seemed restless, pacing the house and scanning their surroundings as though expecting trouble. But Hilda's steady routine and calm presence eventually eased his vigilance. Together, they found a rhythm, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. The days felt ordinary, filled with the hum of suburban life. Yet, in the evenings, as Hilda locked her doors and Max settled at her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet world might soon face a disruption. It was a fleeting thought, one she quickly dismissed. After all, with Max by her side, what could possibly go wrong? Sunday mornings at the church had always been a cornerstone of Hilda's week. She found solace in the hymns, the warmth of her neighbors, and the brief chats after the service. This Sunday, however, the usual atmosphere of fellowship was clouded by unease. "Did you hear about the Thompsons' break-in last week?" Mrs. Eldridge whispered to a small group of women as they gathered near the coffee table. "Middle of the night. They were home. Thank heavens no one got hurt." Hilda, standing nearby, adjusted her scarf and joined the conversation. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "Same as the others," Mrs. Eldridge continued, lowering her voice as though the culprits might be listening. "They think it's the same group targeting homes on this side of town. The police say they're doing all they can, but..." She let the sentence hang ominously in the air. Hilda listened carefully, but her expression remained calm. "I'm sure the police are handling it," she said, offering a reassuring smile. "And of course there's Max. He keeps me safe." Several women chuckled nervously. Max's reputation preceded him. His commanding presence had earned him both admiration and a hint of fear among the neighbors. Hilda often joked that she felt safer with him than she would with an alarm system, but her lightheartedness was met with skepticism this time. "Even a dog can't do everything," Mrs. Eldridge replied, shaking her head. "You should be careful, Hilda. These aren't just petty thieves, they're bold." Across town, in a dimly lit basement cluttered with discarded beer cans and crumpled takeout boxes, two young men hunched over a coffee table. Raul, wiry and restless, scribbled on a scrap of paper while Davi, broader but no less anxious, tapped his fingers against his knee. "We can't keep waiting," Raul muttered, his voice sharp with impatience. "The rent's overdue. If we don't pay this week, we're out." Davy glanced toward the window, where faint sunlight filtered through heavy curtains. "I know," he said, his tone defensive. "But we can't mess this up. We need to find someone easy, a quick job." Raul leaned back, rubbing his temples. His mind raced, weighing their options. For weeks, they'd hovered on the edge of desperation, each bad decision digging them deeper into a hole. The recent string of robberies had emboldened them, but they weren't stupid. Picking the wrong target could mean prison or worse. "What about that old lady?" Raul said suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Which one?" "The one with the dog. Lives alone, always walking around with that big shepherd." Davy hesitated. "You sure about that? That dog looks like it could tear someone apart." Raul smirked. "It's just a dog. Besides, we're not going after the dog. We'll wait for the right moment, when she's distracted." Davy still looked uncertain but nodded reluctantly. The promise of a quick score was too tempting to resist. Later that day, as Hilda prepared Max's dinner, she replayed the church conversation in her mind. She wasn't one to live in fear, but the unease of her neighbors had a way of sticking. Still, as she glanced at Max, his calm yet alert demeanor reassured her. "You'd never let anything happen to me, would you, boy?" she said softly, scratching behind his ears. Max leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slightly. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, two figures lingered, watching, waiting. Raul adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, pulling it low over his eyes as he leaned against a graffiti-covered wall. The small park in the center of the neighborhood was alive with the hum of a late afternoon, children laughing, couples chatting on benches, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was a scene of quiet normalcy, but Raul's gaze was fixed on one person. "There she is," he murmured, nodding toward Hilda. She sat on her usual bench, knitting something delicate while Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog's ears twitched every so often, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings with an almost unsettling focus. Davy, sitting beside Raul, chewed the inside of his cheek. "I don't know, man. That dog doesn't mess around." Raul shot him a look. "We've talked about this. She's perfect, alone, old, and distracted. The dog's a bluff. She's probably had him for years. He's too used to this easy life to do anything." Davy didn't look convinced. "What if you're wrong?" "I'm not wrong," Raul snapped, his voice low and firm. "We just wait until she's heading home. She always takes that same path. We'll catch her when it's quiet. Simple." Hilda glanced up from her knitting, noticing the sun dipping lower in the sky. The vibrant pinks and oranges of sunset bathed the park in soft light. She folded her project neatly and tucked it into her bag. "Time to go, Max," she said, her tone as light as the gentle evening breeze. Max stood immediately, shaking out his coat before falling into step beside her. Hilda couldn't help but smile. His discipline never wavered, a testament to his years of training. As she walked, her mind wandered to the days when her husband had accompanied her on these evening strolls. It was a bittersweet memory, but Max's presence always grounded her. They passed familiar landmarks, the old oak tree where children often played, the quiet cafe that closed before nightfall, and the narrow alley that connected the park to her street. It was a shortcut she'd taken countless times without a second thought. From their spot across the park, Raul and Davi began to move. Sticking to the shadows, they trailed Hilda at a safe distance, careful not to draw attention. "She's heading for the alley," Raul whispered. Davi hesitated, his steps faltering. "Maybe we should just let it go. We could find someone else, someone without a dog." Raul grabbed his arm, his voice a sharp hiss. "Are you serious? We've been planning this for days. It's her. Now pull it together." Reluctantly, Davi nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. As Hilda reached the mouth of the alley, Max slowed his pace, his ears perking up. He paused and sniffed the air, his body tensing. "What's the matter, boy?" Hilda asked, glancing down at him. Max didn't respond with his usual wag of the tail. Instead, his eyes darted to the shadows behind them. Raul and Davi stopped just short of entering the alley, watching as Hilda and Max disappeared into the dimly lit passage. "Now or never," Raul muttered, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. Davy swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. Let's get this over with. As they stepped into the alley, the sound of their footsteps echoed faintly against the brick walls, growing louder as they closed the distance. Ahead of them, Max's head turned sharply. His body shifted, and a low growl began to rumble deep in his chest. Hilda's hand tightened instinctively on the leash. "Max?" she whispered, her voice tinged with confusion and concern. The dog's response was immediate, his protective instincts awakening in an instant. The evening was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Hilda's footsteps echoed gently on the pavement as she walked alongside Max, the familiar rhythm of their stroll calming her nerves. The alley they were entering was a shortcut she had taken countless times, a path that connected the park to her street. The sounds of the neighborhood behind her, the distant laughter of children, the low hum of a passing car, faded as she ventured deeper into the narrow passage. But tonight, something was different. Max, usually content with the walk, was noticeably alert. His ears were raised, his eyes scanning the dimming shadows with a focused intensity. Hilda glanced down at him, puzzled. "Max, what is it, boy?" she murmured softly. The dog didn't answer with his usual calm demeanor. Instead, he tugged gently on the leash as if urging her to keep moving, faster. Hilda felt a sudden, inexplicable chill spread through her. She paused for a moment, looking back toward the park. There was no one in sight, no sign of any trouble. The neighborhood was still as ever. Yet Max's behavior made her uneasy. She adjusted her grip on the leash, now holding it more tightly, and began walking a little quicker, urging Max to stay by her side. The evening air felt heavier, charged with an unknown tension. Meanwhile, Raoul and Davi were no more than a few meters behind. They had been watching Hilda's every move from the shadows, careful not to make a sound. They had followed her so closely that, at times, Davy felt as though the rhythmic pace of his breath would give them away. Raoul's eyes were fixed on the dog. "That's the one. We go in when she hits the alley's narrowest point. Quick, easy, and out." His voice was a low whisper, but there was a confident edge to it. He had done this before. Davy swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't know, man. I don't like this. Not with that dog around." Raoul shot him a look. "You think I like it? We're already here. No turning back." But Davi wasn't convinced. His unease was growing, and with each step, the darkness of the alley seemed to close in on him. "Just keep quiet," Raoul hissed, starting to move faster. "Get in position." They continued their approach, inching closer, the tension between them palpable. Max's pace quickened as Hilda walked on, the leash pulling taut as he tugged her forward. The alley stretched out in front of them, narrow and winding, the walls seeming to close in with every step. She could feel her heart rate pick up in sync with Max's movements. Something was wrong. Something was off. Just as they neared the darkest stretch of the alley, Hilda's senses heightened. A faint rustle behind her sent a shiver up her spine. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing, just the faint, lingering shadows of the trees lining the street. Max's growl broke the silence, low and deep, vibrating through the air. Hilda stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide, scanning the alley. "Max?" she whispered, unsure of what she was feeling. Max didn't respond with a bark or a frantic whine. Instead, his body was rigid, his gaze locked forward, as though he had seen something she couldn't. She took a step back, instinctively moving away from whatever danger Max had sensed. That's when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps approaching. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Raoul and Davi, only steps away now, could almost taste the success. But when they heard the growl, a sound so sharp and primal it froze them in place. Raoul's hand tightened around the knife, his eyes narrowing. "Damn it, it's on to us." Davi looked at him, wide-eyed. "We need to go." But Raoul's stubbornness flared. "We're too close now. We don't leave without the job done." He moved toward the alley's entrance, just a few feet away from where Hilda stood, trembling. Max's growl grew louder, more menacing, and Hilda's fingers tightened on the leash. She was no longer just walking. She was in survival mode. "Max, stay!" she commanded, her voice shaking, but steady enough to catch the dog's attention. Max didn't hesitate. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, his body positioned between Hilda and the approaching figures. His teeth flashed white in the dim light, a silent warning to anyone who thought they could get past him. The alley was suddenly charged with tension. Hilda could feel the weight of Max's protective stance as he positioned himself between her and the looming figures. Her heart hammered in her chest and her breath came in short bursts, but she knew she couldn't panic, not with Max at her side. Raul and Davi came into full view, their figures emerging from the shadows. Hilda's grip tightened on the leash, her body instinctively moving back a few paces as Max growled again, more fiercely this time. "What do you want?" Hilda's voice was calm, but a tremor of uncertainty was there. Raul didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, taking in the old woman with her large, imposing dog. His confidence faltered just slightly at the sight of Max, but he quickly regained control. "We're not here to chat, lady," Raul said, his voice cold. He flicked the blade of the knife open with a sharp snap. "Hand over your purse, and no one gets hurt." Hilda's mind raced. She could sense the danger in Raul's eyes, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down, not with Max's training and instincts so finely honed. Max, standing firm and unwavering, seemed to sense that Hilda wasn't going to give in. His body tensed further, and his growl deepened into a menacing snarl. Raul took a step forward, brandishing the knife in front of him. "I'm serious, old lady. We don't want trouble, but we will get it if you don't comply." Hilda felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew the situation was escalating, but she couldn't let fear overtake her. She met Raul's gaze steadily, trying to buy time. "Max, stay close," she whispered. Max, ever the professional, didn't move. His body was rigid, his eyes locked on Raul, as though waiting for the slightest hint of a move. Then it happened. A sharp, sudden movement. Raul lunged toward Hilda, aiming to grab her purse. In a flash, Max reacted. With incredible speed, Max lunged forward, his teeth bared, his body a blur of motion. Raul's knife barely had time to glint in the low light before Max's powerful jaws closed around the man's wrist, forcing the weapon to drop. The pain in Raul's face was immediate, but there was no time to react further. Max released his grip, but not before pushing Raul back with a force that sent him stumbling. Davy, who had been frozen with indecision, watched in horror as his partner was thrown to the ground. The knife was left forgotten in the alley, discarded in the dirt. "Raul!" Davy shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Max stood between them, growling low in his throat, daring them to take one more step. The dog's sheer presence was enough to immobilize them both. Raul, clutching his bleeding wrist, scrambled back against the wall. Hilda stepped back, her heart still racing. Max's defensive posture was unwavering, his focus entirely on the two intruders. Hilda could feel the raw power in the dog's body, the culmination of years of training and experience. She had always known Max was capable, but never had she seen him in such action. "Get out of here," Hilda said, her voice low but firm, "before I let him finish what he started." Raul didn't need any more encouragement. He scrambled to his feet, his face pale with fear. Davy, still hesitant, shot a terrified glance at Max and then backed away slowly, his eyes wide with panic. The two men turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the alley, leaving behind only the faint sound of their hurried footsteps. Hilda's breath came in ragged gasps as she took a few steps back, her legs unsteady. She looked down at Max, who was still standing guard, his eyes scanning the alley for any signs of further danger. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice shaking. She couldn't help the tears that welled up in her eyes. She felt a rush of relief, a sense of gratitude so deep that it overwhelmed her. Max, his work done, relaxed slightly, but remained alert, his gaze never leaving the alley. He was waiting, ready for whatever might come next. Hilda stood there for a moment, taking in the magnitude of the situation. She was shaken, but she knew one thing for sure: she was safe. The air in the alley was thick with the remnants of tension. Hilda stood still, her heart still racing, the sound of Raul and Davi's hurried retreat echoing faintly in the distance. Her hands trembled as she held the leash, but she couldn't take her eyes off Max. The dog's stance had softened slightly, but his alertness never wavered. His eyes scanned the alley, his sharp senses attuned to every rustle, every shift in the air. Hilda took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She'd been in dangerous situations before, but none had shaken her like this. The weight of what had just happened was starting to sink in. "Max," she whispered, bending down to stroke the dog's head. His fur was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt a deep connection to him, a bond that went beyond words. Max had protected her, and she knew without a doubt that he would continue to do so. But she also knew that the danger wasn't over. The men might have run off for now, but they wouldn't forget her. Or Max. Max's ears perked up and he shifted slightly, his body tense again. He was still on high alert, his instincts never allowing him to fully relax. Hilda followed his gaze, instinctively searching the alley for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. The sounds of the neighborhood seemed to fade away, and in the stillness it felt as though the world had paused. Hilda stood straighter, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay in the alley forever, but she didn't feel safe heading back to her house just yet. Raul and Davi might have been scared off for now, but how long would that last? "Come on, Max," she said softly, her voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "Let's get out of here." Max, always in tune with her needs, moved beside her, his body slightly turned toward the alley entrance, as if to block anything from approaching. He was her shield, her protector, and in that moment, he made her feel invincible. It didn't take long for Hilda to make her decision. She couldn't stay on edge for too long, not when the danger had passed, at least for now. But she would take the long way home, avoiding any shortcuts. The streets were still calm, but the fear from the encounter lingered in the air, almost tangible. Max continued to lead the way, his posture still firm, his eyes scanning every shadow and corner. Hilda felt a deep sense of gratitude for the dog, for his unwavering loyalty and strength. He had been a part of the police force once, trained to handle far more dangerous situations than this. And yet, it was in these quiet, personal moments that his true strength showed, protecting the woman who had given him a second chance at life. As they walked, Hilda noticed that the normal sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, the occasional car passing by, seemed muted, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't just her mind playing tricks. The world around her felt different. Every creak of a door, every whisper of wind seemed to hold more meaning now. Max's growl brought her back to the present. She stopped, turning to look down at him. His posture had changed, ears back, hackles raised. Something was wrong. Hilda's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what Max had sensed, but the dog was never wrong. The streets that had always felt so safe now felt like they were closing in on her. "Max," she said again, her voice filled with both uncertainty and trust. "What is it, boy?" Max took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on something ahead. Hilda followed his gaze, her heart racing. The street was empty, there was no one in sight, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his focus. Then without warning, a faint sound reached her ears. A rustle, a quick movement. Max's growl deepened into a menacing bark. The danger wasn't over, it was just beginning. Hilda's pulse raced, her body tense with every second that passed. Max had already positioned himself, his head slightly lowered, eyes locked on something ahead in the darkness. She followed his gaze, trying to make out what had triggered his heightened alertness. For a moment, there was nothing. No sign of movement, no shapes emerging from the shadows. But the feeling of being watched, of danger lingering just out of sight, was palpable. Hilda instinctively reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency number. But before she could even press call, Max's sharp bark cut through the silence. Without warning, two figures emerged from the alley's entrance. Raul and Davi looking even more desperate now, their faces twisted with frustration and fear. "Stay back!" Hilda shouted, her voice firm despite the growing fear within her. She felt Max's muscles tighten beside her, his growl deepening into a menacing rumble. Raul, his wrists still bleeding from Max's earlier attack, took a step forward, his eyes darting between Hilda and the dog. We just want the purse," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. He knew, as did Davy, that they had underestimated Max, underestimated the power of the trained police dog who had now become Hilda's steadfast protector. "I won't say it again," Hilda said, her voice unwavering. "Get out of here, now!" Max's low growl escalated into a sharp, aggressive bark. The men froze. Behind them, the faint sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was approaching, someone who could help. Hilda held her breath, praying that the arrival of another person might make a difference, might give her the opportunity to escape this nightmare. The footsteps grew nearer, and within moments a figure emerged. A neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, out for a late walk. Her pace quickened with concern when she heard the commotion. "Hilda, are you all right?" Mrs. Aldridge called out, her voice full of worry. She was alone, but the presence of a friendly face was enough to help Hilda regain a sense of control. Raul and Davi turned their heads, startled by the new voice. They hesitated, clearly weighing their options. "Get away from her," Mrs. Aldridge shouted, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police right now." Max's posture remained tense, but as he sensed the new presence, he seemed to relax slightly, trusting that the immediate threat was being taken care of. Raul, clearly unwilling to be caught with their intentions so exposed, snarled and turned to run. He pushed past Davy, who hesitated, looking back at Hilda and Max. But the sight of Max's intimidating stance, his posture now solid and resolute, was enough to convince him to follow. Without another word, the two men fled down the alley and into the darkness. Hilda exhaled in a shaky breath, her heart still pounding in her chest. Max, ever watchful, didn't move until the danger had truly passed. I don't know what to say," Hilda said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Aldridge, still holding her phone, looked at her with a concerned gaze. "You're safe now, Hilda. And that dog, he's a hero." Hilda nodded, her eyes falling to Max, who stood with a quiet dignity beside her. She reached down to pat his head, her hand shaking. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes softening. He was calm again, but Hilda knew that if the danger had persisted, he would have been ready to act in an instant. His training had never truly left him. The sirens were growing louder now, and within minutes, the police arrived, their lights flashing brightly against the darkness. Hilda watched as they approached, but her thoughts were still on the moments that had just passed. Her neighborhood, once so peaceful, now felt foreign, filled with an unfamiliar tension that wouldn't soon fade. But there was one thing that remained unchanged. Max was with her. The officers spoke briefly with Hilda, taking down the details of the encounter and inspecting the alley where the attempted robbery had taken place. They confirmed that the men would likely be apprehended soon, given the evidence of the struggle. As they spoke, Hilda stood quietly beside Max, her hand resting gently on his back. She was still shaken, but she knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The officer who had been speaking with her turned to Max, nodding with respect. "That's one hell of a dog you've got there, ma'am. He saved your life tonight." Hilda smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He's more than just a dog. He's my friend, my protector." The officer gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and after a few more questions, the police finally began to wrap up their investigation. As they left, Hilda and Max were left alone once more in the quiet alley. The night felt different now, safer perhaps, but with an edge of caution. Hilda took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on Max. "You've done enough, boy. Let's get home." Max, as always, was ready. His body relaxed slightly as he trotted beside her, guiding her back to the warmth and comfort of their home. Together they walked down the quiet street, the shadows no longer as ominous as before. By the time Hilda and Max reached home, the adrenaline had started to wear off, leaving her feeling both drained and relieved. The streets, once filled with an unsettling quiet, now felt peaceful again, as though the evening's events had been nothing more than a bad dream. But every step she took, she was reminded that it was real. Max's steady presence at her side was proof enough. As they reached her front door, Hilda paused and turned to look at Max, her heart swelling with pride and affection. He had been her guardian tonight, and in that moment, she felt an overwhelming gratitude. "You're my hero, Max," she whispered, reaching down to rub behind his ears. He looked up at her with his usual calm gaze, his tail wagging just a little, a soft acknowledgement of her praise. The sound of sirens still echoed in the distance, but Hilda felt a strange calm settle over her. She had been through something terrifying, yes, but she knew that with Max by her side, she had nothing to fear. Inside, Hilda took a moment to sit down, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Max lay at her feet, his body relaxed but alert, as always. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady herself. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. Hilda hadn't expected any visitors, and for a moment she hesitated. But when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a group of neighbors, Mrs. Aldridge among them. "Hello, Hilda," Mrs. Aldridge said with a warm smile. "We heard what happened. Are you okay?" Hilda nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. "Yes, I'm fine. It was a bit of a shock, but Max kept me safe." The other neighbors, a mixture of familiar faces from her church in the block, looked at Max with a new sense of admiration. They had all heard the whispers about him, the retired police dog with a history of service. But hearing the story of how he had defended Hilda that night made them see him in a new light. "We all wanted to stop by and thank you," Mrs. Aldridge continued, glancing down at Max. "But mostly, we wanted to thank Max. He really saved your life tonight." Max, sensing the attention, sat up slightly and gave a small wag of his tail. He was content, but the truth of it was clear. His job was never truly done. One of the other neighbors, Mr. Reynolds, stepped forward. He had a few years on Hilda, but always had a kind word to share. "We've all been talking," he said, his voice warm but firm. "You and Max, you're heroes in this neighborhood. You both gave us hope tonight." Hilda felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she smiled, grateful for the support. She had always loved her little community, but tonight, something had shifted. The sense of unity and resilience was palpable now, and it made her feel proud to be a part of it. "We're just doing what we need to do," Hilda replied softly, "but thank you. I'm so lucky to have all of you in my life." The neighbors nodded in agreement. Mrs. Aldridge placed a hand on Hilda's shoulder. "It's not luck, Hilda. It's courage. You're a strong woman, and Max is just as strong. We're all here for you." Hilda felt a warmth spread through her chest as she glanced down at Max. He was sitting calmly by her side, a quiet sentinel, his eyes scanning the room as if ensuring that everyone was safe. The doorbell rang again, this time a bit more urgently. A police officer, one of the officers who had responded earlier, stepped into the room. He was a familiar face, someone Hilda had met during one of the neighborhood's community meetings. "Good evening, Mrs. Hilda," he said with a kind smile. "I just wanted to stop by and let you know that Raul and Davi were caught just a few blocks away. They were trying to flee, but thanks to Max's quick thinking, we had enough evidence to bring them in." Hilda's heart gave a little flutter of relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I'm glad it's over." The officer nodded. "We all owe Max a debt of gratitude. His bravery helped us bring them in faster than we anticipated, and with the evidence, we're confident they won't be back for a while." Hilda turned to Max, her heart swelling with love. "Max, you did it again." Max, as if on cue, gave another small wag of his tail, content in the knowledge that his job was done for the night. As the officer left and the neighbors slowly made their way back to their homes, Hilda closed the door and leaned against it, taking a long, deep breath. The night was winding down, and for the first time since the encounter, Hilda felt the weight of the situation begin to lift. She had been tested in ways she never could have imagined. But through it all, she had come out stronger, and Max, her faithful companion, had proven once again that he was more than just a dog. He was her protector, her hero, and tonight he had made all the difference. The following week, the neighborhood felt different. There was a renewed sense of unity among the residents, a shared understanding that they weren't alone in facing challenges. The fear of the previous weeks had faded, replaced by a growing determination to stand together. Hilda and Max became symbols of resilience in the community. Word of Max's bravery spread quickly, and soon the local paper ran a story about the retired police dog who had saved his owner's life. People began stopping by Hilda's house, expressing their gratitude and admiration. In a small park near Hilda's home, the neighborhood held a gathering to honor Max's courage. It was a simple event, but it was filled with warmth and gratitude. Neighbors exchanged stories, and children played with Max, who accepted their attention with his usual calm demeanor. Hilda stood at the center of it all, watching her beloved dog interact with the community. She had never imagined that one act of bravery could bring so much change. As she stood there, with Max by her side, Hilda knew the neighborhood was stronger than it had been before, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Hilda and Max resumed their daily walks, now greeted by friendly waves and smiles from their neighbors. The park that had once felt filled with quiet tension now brimmed with laughter and lightness as the community bonded over shared stories of resilience. Despite the newfound peace, Max remained ever watchful. His steps were as precise as ever, his eyes scanning their surroundings, his ears twitching at every sound. Hilda, content but vigilant, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Max had kept them safe, but in return they had given him a new purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hilda and Max walked their usual path through the park. The gentle hum of the evening settled around them, the world feeling calm, almost serene. Hilda smiled as she looked down at Max, her companion, her protector. "I'm so lucky to have you," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Max wagged his tail in response, his eyes soft and trusting. He had fulfilled his purpose once more, but for Hilda, their journey together was far from over. Together, they faced the future with quiet strength, ready for whatever came next. The story of Hilda and Max teaches us that true strength often lies in the most unexpected places, whether it's the fierce loyalty of a dog or the quiet courage of a person who's learned to trust in what truly matters. In times of crisis, it's not always the physical strength that saves us, but the resilience to stand tall and face what's ahead. How would you react if faced with a similar challenge? Would you find the courage to trust in those around you? Or would you falter in fear? Click the video on your screen now to continue your journey of self-discovery and uncover what true courage looks like in your own life. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories and insights that will help you grow and unlock your inner strength. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.